Hola, buenas tardes. Unfortunately, that's the extent of my Spanish, so I won't embarrass myself or you by continuing any further. But I would like to start by thanking the Chamber for the invitation to speak today. I've had a very busy couple of days since I landed here. I'm still on UK time, so I'm still 5 hours ahead, so do bear with me. But I was asked to come and talk about the implementation of drug and alcohol policies within our organisation within the UK. So, VolkerWessels UK, we are part of a group of Dutch construction companies, and we have approximately 16,000 employees across the country, across the world, with offices in the Netherlands, the UK, obviously, and Canada and the United States. In the United Kingdom, we have approximately 3,000 staff, but we have an overall workforce of just over 7,000 staff working for us at any one time. And we therefore, as a result, work somewhere in the region of about 18 million hours in a traditional year. My role as Corporate Responsibility Director is quite broad. I try not to think about this too much. I do sleep very well, but I've been with the organisation for 13 years, and in construction for 25 years. And my duties, whilst they are broad, primarily focus on the oversight of health, safety, environment, quality and sustainability. And a large part of that is as a safety director to our group. And one thing I often reflect on is the fact that I am always learning. I think I've done more exams, more qualifications since leaving school than when I did when I was at school, and I'm probably better at it now than I was back then. But I've unfortunately left it a little bit late to brush up on my Spanish. But my 13-year-old daughter has been trying very hard to help me, to very little success. But my role, as is shown on the slide, is broad in the sense that I have many duties, but there is so much interrelationship between these aspects. And whilst I'm going to talk primarily around drugs and alcohol, it comes from a huge amount of experience and working with a very positive and very honest group of people. And I must say that that's also been reflected in the people that I've met over the past couple of days, firing lots of questions and asking for lots of information. I'm watching several screens, so too much going on. So within VolkerWessels UK, we have an occupational health service where we directly employ occupational nurses and technicians. And we made a decision back in 2007 to directly employ nurses, and it was probably the best decision we could have made, even though we didn't know it at the time. And that service, having been in place for 12 years, has very much been the foundation of the health and well-being services that we provide to our employees. And that covers a range of services from statutory health surveillance that we're required to do by law, but also through to proactive health and well-being, and in recent years, quite a considerable amount of work around mental health. So why is there a duty to manage drugs and alcohol in the workplace? I think from my very rough translation of the film that preceded me, there clearly is an issue, and we all recognise that. That's not the problem, it's not the understanding. And even when we have legislation in the UK that requires us to place a duty to manage drugs and alcohol in the workplace, that's not what we lead with. We don't lead with the law. We don't walk onto construction sites and have probably what is about 180 pieces of legislation in the UK in relation to health, safety and environment. And we don't kind of slap people around with the law. We try and keep that very simple. But we have some very simple laws, the Health and Safety at Work Act, which was introduced in 1974 in the UK, which places a general duty on employers to take care of the health and well-being of everyone working on their behalf, and also those that are affected by their undertakings. There's additional regulations, such as the Management of Health and Work at regulations. There's other specific regulations within the rail industry in the UK. And in many respects, they are very similar to articles within your own labour codes in this general duty of care that they place upon organisations for those working on their behalf, and not just your own employees. And before I move on, that's probably a key point of discussion over the past couple of days. It's actually standing up and making a decision. I'm often described as the moral compass of our business, and it's important that organisations do make a stand and bring about change, because it just takes one organisation to make a start and others will follow. And it's that collaboration in construction that then makes a difference. There is this greater requirement, though, from a moral standpoint. And as I said, we're very keen within VolkerWessels UK to maintain a culture that is committed to providing a health, safe and productive working environment, because we recognise that drugs and alcohol have an impact on an individual's ability to work safely. And that's reflected in the presentation, the film that we had a short while ago. And we recognise that drug and alcohol misuse can impair judgment, make people overconfident and more likely to take risks. And reactions can be slowed, judgment of distance is affected, and your field of vision may be reduced. Good organisations take the health and safety and well-being of everyone working on their behalf as a core duty, as a core responsibility. And even with all of the evidence that goes with the research around drugs and alcohol, it's very much this moral duty of organisations that should be the conversation that you're having at the highest level. There's another consideration with the drugs, the recreational drugs of choice, something that we are aware of within the UK when we talk about gateway drugs. So drugs, we have the same failures, as I'll discuss, around use of cannabis and cocaine, but they're described as gateway drugs because they often lead others to taking harder drugs, particularly as they age. They seek a new high because the old drugs aren't working. So in implementing drug and alcohol policies and tackling concerns over cannabis and cocaine, you're also helping in preventing that next step. And that moral imperative, that strongly felt principle, is that organisations must act to manage the potential for drug and alcohol in the workplace in order to protect the health and well-being of everyone. Strangely, in the UK, there's actually a lack of evidence between drug and alcohol use and accidents. It isn't data that's typically recorded by our regulator. There are many workplace surveys. There are many national surveys around drug and alcohol use. However, there is very little evidence around links between accidents and drug abuse. You could, however, argue that an 85% reduction in fatalities since 1974 and the health and safety at work being introduced demonstrate a clear overall improvement in site safety. But when it comes to drug and alcohol policies, you have to have a very clear justification for having a policy that is linked to the improvement of health and safety and the prevention of accidents. And also it's important to note that you can't use a drug and alcohol policy to weed out the bad apples from your organisation. You can't target individuals. It has to have the integrity as a standalone policy. One of the surveys from the UK, the slide here on the screen, demonstrates that there is still a considerable concern around drug use in the UK. But we are seeing some changing behaviours. There is evidence from 2017 that actually the younger generations are becoming less involved in drug use and alcohol drinking. I often joke about the fact that it's because children don't get together anymore. They don't gather. Social media, like my oldest daughter, she's at home, she's on her phone, doing this all the time, so she doesn't need to go out. And actually the positive side to that is actually leading to a reduction in some of the concerns around drug and alcohol use. However, there is evidence in the UK that demonstrates, particularly when looking at powder cocaine, that those that used it in their early years continue to use it as they progress later in life. So the percentage of use in earlier generations in the UK has decreased, but the percentage use in the middle age demographic has actually increased as they've continued to use the drug throughout their ongoing life. And it's an interesting observation. It's something that we are certainly very aware of and very considerate of in the policies that we apply. So when we look at our statistics, and I share these very carefully, but it is about being open, we, as I said, have 7,000 staff approximately working for us at any one time, 7,000 people. And in last year, we conducted almost 2,000 screening tests, and our failure rate was just over 4%. And that's been a fairly consistent number for many years. You can see from the statistics that cocaine and cannabis form the bulk of those failures. But what's very interesting is we have no issues with alcohol. It's become the norm that people are more attuned to the concerns regarding alcohol, and to have only one failure relating to that in the whole year from that volume of tests is quite a considerable achievement. But one of the factors within the UK that we are perhaps quite lucky is that there are certain requirements within certain industries, such as the rail industry, where if you fail a test for drugs and alcohol, you lose your right to work in the rail industry for 5 years. To work in the rail industry, there was a certification that you carry, and if you fail a drugs test, that you will lose that card and you are prevented from reapplying for 5 years. The alcohol limits are very low in the rail industry. They're close to zero, but not quite. And so workers in the rail industry are already very aware of the impact. They know it will affect their livelihood. And therefore, when it comes to drug and alcohol policies, it does make our life somewhat easier. An important distinction, though, is for us, it's medication. And it's very important that you have clear requirements on declaring medication use within your operations. People can take over-the-counter medications or be prescribed something that can have an impact on their ability to perform their normal duties. But also, people will use other people's medication. Somebody taking their partner's sleeping tablets. And particularly when you consider that for somebody who is conducting a safety critical operation, it can have a serious implication. So we have processes where at site induction, people have to report use of medication. We use third-party chemists to assess that medication as well. And if necessary, we will consider the task that that individual is undertaking, and we will determine whether we need to reallocate them to other duties whilst they're taking that medication. It's also an important part of the screening process. So we stress to people that when on medication, you report it in advance, because it's not uncommon that, not surprisingly, when people fail a drug screen, that suddenly they tell you everything that they're taking. And medication is probably one of the more complex areas. And I did a biology degree. I'm not an engineer. And I did chemistry before that. And I have found myself now going into detailed research around metabolism of hard recreational drugs. So I'm very interested at parties, but I have to be very careful about how I share that information. But you have to have a clear understanding of medication and how the body metabolizes that, because we require people to report medication in advance of screening. And a key thing with the screening process is we will support you in advance of any screening, but if you wait until you fail and run the gauntlet, so to speak, to see if you're caught out, then we have to enact procedures, as I'll come on to. So it is about providing support as well, and it's a key part of the process. And in the socialising of any policy that you're producing, you have to be very clear on your language. You have to make people understand why you are doing a policy on drugs and alcohol. And you have to give people the opportunity to come forward and report any concern. And offer an opportunity to give them support. We are in the UK fortunate that we have lots of NHS, National Health Service organisations that can provide that support. And we will give employees every opportunity to seek help. However, we do have to be quite strict, again, when it comes to the actual screening process and the timing around when they report that problem. So it has to be done in advance of the screening process. So I was asked to think about some of the considerations for setting a policy. And a key starting point is that the policy must apply equally to everyone. It has to apply to the highest member of the business, to the person at the coalface. You have to be consistent. There cannot be any double standards. You have to apply the process, the policy equally, and you have to be clear on your justification. You also have to be very considerate of history and geography. Even within the UK, we will find certain areas of the country where we don't normally work, where the supply chain, the contractors, aren't used to being screened for drugs and alcohol. And then you find your failure rate goes up, and it's something you have to be considerate of, but apply the policy the same way. You have to review and then revise the policy on a regular basis. Recreational drugs change. You have to be mindful of the drug of choice as well, particularly with synthetic drugs coming onto the market. And so the policy has to be kept up to date. You have to consult as part of that implementation. But there's a balance. You can't consult with everyone because too many voices makes it very difficult to get anywhere. But the ultimate aim of the policy has to be to support rather than to punish. And In establishing the policy, you have to determine the type of testing that you're going to do, and I'll talk about that shortly. But as I said previously, you have to offer support to those who admit to a drug and alcohol problem in advance of screening. In then taking that policy forward and implementing that policy, there are certain steps to consider. You have to determine who's responsible for the policy. That task in our case falls to me, and I'm quite clear on my duties under that policy, but it does become quite difficult. You treat all failures on a case-by-case basis, and it becomes very personal, and you have to keep it personal. If you just see it as a black and white issue, screening, pass and fail, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons. You have to take into account that people are involved. It has to have commitment from the top. You have to consult with third parties, including the laboratories that you may use to do the testing. Learn from others, including Construction Summit presenters, like myself, I guess, and ensure in doing so that your policy is thorough and it's not incomplete. We've been talking over the past couple of days around how we would implement such a policy, and it's often a good idea to announce it in advance. So set a date for implementation. So fix a date 3-6 months down the line to give the business and the workforce the opportunity to adapt, is the polite way to describe it. If you launch something and say it's going live, tomorrow, next week, then I guarantee you will spend nothing but chase your tail in those initial weeks in its implementation. Also, we've placed requirements in employment contracts. So we make it very clear to individuals that they will be screened at employment, randomly, and in other circumstances. And also, as part of contract negotiations with subcontractors, we make it very clear to them that we do have policies on drugs and alcohol in place. And in our site inductions, we make it very clear that we do test for drugs and alcohol. So there are no misconceptions. Three ways to test. And you may consider actually, if you're implementing a new policy, not necessarily doing all of these at once. It might be commonplace to start with random screening. But I do recommend doing all three types of screening when you fully implement a policy on drugs and alcohol. I am amazed by what people do. It's the one, I guess it's the biggest lesson of my job, is never be surprised by what people do. And even when we send people a letter in the employment contract that advises them that they will come for a drug and alcohol screen, people still manage to fail. So that's why we continue with new starter screening, because of that concern. Random screening, I'll explain in more detail, but it's a percentage of your workforce on a regular basis. And then for cause, it covers a broad variety of opportunities where you might consider screening. There's a slight delay. Okay. So, I've gone back. 1 second. So with new starters, as I said, we have two requirements. One with the rail industry, where we screen in advance of them starting. With all other employees, we screen within the first 3 weeks. Random screening is unannounced. It's unannounced random screening for drugs and alcohol that could take place at any work, whilst on work or on duty, of anyone, staff, subcontractor or agency. And we aim to screen approximately 5% of people on an annual basis. Typically, we do somewhere between 5 and 10%. and we also screen a minimum number of people. So we have a range of sites from the very small to the very large, but we always aim to screen at least 6 people, so that you're not seen as targeting individuals either. The for-cause screening it's quite different, because it not only covers screening post-incident, so major accident or fatality, it covers situations where you may be made aware of someone who is under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or there is a change in behaviour. The loud person becomes quiet, the quiet person becomes loud, or they may be underperforming, significant changes in behaviours, or irregular attendance at work. And again, you know, there are slight differences in the application between the rail industry and the non-rail industry, but for-cause screening would typically also target a group of people. The screening process is a very important part. And how you screen for drugs and alcohol is there to safeguard employees' rights and confidentiality and dignity. And you would only do the screening, have it conducted by an occupational health nurse or a third-party organisation. And we always use urine as the sample. There are different means and methods to conduct screening, but we find that the urine sample is the most accurate. And also, a lot of third-party organisations within the UK would validate that is the most accurate means of testing. The kits themselves, these devices, they are small, they're cost-effective, and the language that we use within our business is that they're also there to separate the positives from the non-negatives. It's very important language that 96% of our people pass the screening process. And these enable us to do it very quickly, very effectively, and at a very low cost. As I said, we typically use urine, but when you look at some of the other devices that are available, there are devices that will take saliva swabs, but these devices aren't as effective. They don't screen for all drugs. They also have a very discrete window where they can confirm there is a drug present. And so we often have this discussion around what is the right screening method, but always we are resolute, we are consistent in the need to use these testing pots and stick with using a urine sample. When we look then at what happens with the screening process, we use the term non-negative. We don't use the term fail. So when you use the integrated cups, you don't tell someone they failed. It's a very difficult position because it's the laboratory screening that is the important bit for us. It's also legally defensible. And the pot tests, they're very accurate, but also there's an understanding of the chemistry that's quite important, particularly with regards to medication. So you use the term non-negative, and what you do at that stage is, with both employees and subcontractors, is you suspend them from work. For subcontractors, you remove them from site, pending the results of that screening. And that's a very important stage, but also recognising that you have to be very considerate that you are playing with people's livelihoods. Once then the testing comes through from the laboratory, that's where then we would return to the individual and advise of the result. And sometimes we do find that a non-negative at pot testing does result in a pass. Sometimes because some of the elaborate chemistry that goes on, particularly with medication. So again, that's stressing that importance around waiting for the lab test to confirm the results. Quite surprisingly, in discussions over the past couple of days, I think we have it easy by comparison in the UK in terms of the action that we then take. Because typically, in most cases in the United Kingdom, that when somebody fails a drug and alcohol screen, it's treated as gross misconduct and people are dismissed. For subcontractors, they're removed from sites. And typically, we would ban them from working on one of our sites for a period of at least 2 years. So we're quite clear on the application of our policy. However, as I understand it within Chile, you have more of a duty to look at the reallocation of those workers and providing more support. So in many respects, you have a much greater challenge. So, getting it right, the success factors, just to summarise. You must have a detailed policy which sets out the process. You must understand the subject. So the owner of the policy has to understand the detail. You have to maintain the chain of custody on the screening process because people will question if they believe there's a breach of process. You have quite clear definitions within the policy around limits for alcohol and also the drugs that you screen for, and also have quite extensive arrangements around consideration of medication too. And it's important that you keep the policy under regular review, and if you follow all of those steps, then the policy can work for any organisation. Doesn't matter how big, how small. For me, a large organisation is, well, we use the term in the UK, big is beautiful, but big for me is just more complicated. And a good policy can work for any size of organisation. I spoke about communication. We do a number of internal communications, internal campaigns. We have occupational campaigns that we do on a quarterly and a monthly basis, and we keep drugs and alcohol as a key topic within those campaigns. It's very important that we keep the message within the business, within our communications, and continue to remind people that we have measures in place and policies to enforce the screening process. Because it can go wrong. And when we first started this, I was quite surprised at even when people fail a drug screen for something like cocaine, we have had people take us to employment tribunal because they believe we hadn't followed our policy. So regardless of the fact they agree that they might have failed for a recreational drug, they will still try to seek recompense through employment tribunal because of breach of process. Fortunately, we don't have that as an issue, but it's an important factor to bear in mind. And you have some very interesting conversations. And even now we still have oh yes, I was at a party at the weekend and my friend was smoking cannabis, so that must be what you've picked up. And we can quite easily dispel those myths that being in the same room as somebody else smoking it isn't an excuse when it comes to screening. But you mustn't forget that it's people's livelihoods that are in question here. If you get it wrong, it can have disastrous implications for an individual, but also for an organisation. You have to maintain the integrity. And any failures in process also will become widely known. So people will soon learn that you've set a precedent, you've done something differently, and then that will come back to haunt you for every failure beyond that point. So you have to be consistent. You have to maintain integrity within all of your processes. Briefly, when we look at the benefits of getting it right, we were talking earlier about how can I assess the impact of drug and alcohol policies. And for me, it's part of many things that we've done within the UK around raising our safety culture. We're very fortunate. The very exciting graph on the screen actually demonstrates our safety performance in comparison to the rest of the construction industry in the UK. We don't actually compare ourselves to other construction companies. I don't believe some of the statistics that are reported by individual companies. So we compare to the main industry regulator. And we're in a fortunate position where we have achieved dramatic reductions in accidents across all types of accidents based upon several things that we have introduced within a good safety culture and good safety management systems. And having a good, strong drug and alcohol policy helps support that. It makes it very clear to the workforce that you mean business and that also that you're doing it ultimately for their health and well-being and everyone working on your behalf. So just to close, I'd just like to say that construction is a great industry. When I was at school, I certainly wasn't expecting to be here today talking about drug and alcohol policies. When I was at school, I didn't expect to be a safety director in construction, but I've had 25 years of some great experiences, so some challenges along the way. But my message, I guess, my personal experience and a key point to share is that we do have a duty to make every effort to protect everyone working on our behalf.